Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, I have a pretty interesting subject for this Sunday. It is a discussion, but we will talk about something that I think each of us has wondered at some point or another, and this is, how do our orchids actually feel? You might already know that some orchid growers say my orchid is happy in this setup or in this environment, or others saying my orchid feels secure in such and such manner. But I don't know if you ever wondered, what does this actually mean? What does it imply? Do our orchids actually feel anything at all? So this is what we're gonna talk about today, but before that, please let me do a little intro disclaimer because I feel this is important. It is a very delicate and bushy subject, and because I too have pretty limited knowledge in this department, I will not extend this discussion more than what I know. So we will just talk about the basics, and of course if you want to research further, please go ahead. I do believe it's an interesting subject. At the same time, please do not understand that my video will refer to actual feelings and to the idea that plants feel and they can take decisions, at least in the way that we feel and take decisions. I believe this is a very dangerous subject, particularly for those of us who really don't have scientific knowledge yet or biology knowledge and all of those things. My language in this video will be very familiar, and I will use words that actually apply to humans or animals simply to make this video easy to understand and more appealing actually, but just know that I do not imply or believe that orchids and plants in general feel exactly the way we feel, and we can apply to them things that we can apply to humans or animals, or let's call them intelligent in the broad spectrum of the word, creatures. I believe the subject should be debated by actual scientists with a lot of knowledge and information, people who can actually make proper experiments and can draw plausible conclusions. I do not believe that hobbyists and enthusiasts such as us can actually provide facts in this department. We can provide opinions, but let us just realize they're just opinions, they're not facts. Anyway, sorry for this long intro, but I feel that I have to do it. Let's get to the subject, and I hope I shall be coherent, because it's a bushy one. Let's start. Alrighty, now luckily there has been quite some research, and we do have some facts regarding how do plants in general respond to certain conditions in their environment and also to sensorial stimuli, like touches. Sadly, most research is not done on orchids, but on other plants with a more, let's say, obvious behavior. But we certainly can draw some conclusions. So first of all, let's think about the plants that actually respond to touching stimuli. And the most known ones are vines. As you might know, plants with a vining nature climb on surfaces rather than staying at a certain level from the ground. Why do they do this? Well, because competition. In order to gain advantage, they need to come up with some resourceful ways to obtain certain resources. And one of these resources is light. In a forest dense with tall trees and maybe with bushy plants, it's pretty hard for a tiny little vine to find a spot of light. Therefore, it tries to outcompete the other plants by climbing. Vines can climb on trees or other surfaces such as walls in order to gain more light. And depending on the plant, they have specialized structures to help them reach their goal. Some of them have tendrils that coil around a certain object and sustain the entire weight of the plant. Other plants actually swirl their stem around an object, or maybe not around but on an object, using various mechanisms, thus supporting their entire weight on that surface. As it would appear, the scientists have actually named this phenomenon or behavior, and they have named it Stigma Tropism. I might not pronounce that correctly. So let's read a definition of this word. It refers to a directional growth movement which occurs as a mechanosensory response to a touch stimulus. This behavior is typically found in twining plants and tendrils, but it would appear that biologists have also found this response in flowering plants and even fungi. And well, maybe one of those flowering plants is actually the orchid. We're gonna get to it, and I'm gonna actually give you some examples from my collection. Now that we know the word that describes this mechanism, let's see what other implications there are. Let's see what actually make those tendrils or stems wrap around or climb certain objects. Now in this regard, we kind of need to go a little bit into plant biology and actually see what's going on inside an orchid. Well, there are a lot of chemical processes going on. In orchids or plants, we cannot talk about a brain in the same sense of the word as we refer to us and animals. We also do not find a heart and other structures or organs that we usually find in humans and animals. Plants are totally different creatures, and their responses and their actions are actually governed by their chemical balance. And by chemical balance, I actually refer to a whole diverse group of elements found within an orchid. We find water, we find channels of distribution, we find nutrients or minerals, we find things such as chlorophyll, which is specific to plants and maybe some other organisms, but not specific to humans and animals. We also find hormones, but not the same hormones that we and other animals. They are plant hormones. And all of these things combined dictate how a plant will behave. If a plant has a growth point dictated by its hormones, then that plant will create a new structure from that point. And in the case of our orchids, you know very well the growth points. There are points that can create new plantlets, such as keikis, or new pseudobulbs, or flower spikes. All of these structures are actually dictated by a hormonal balance inside the orchid. The orchid herself doesn't decide, hey, it's time that I make a keiki because, I feel like it. No, it's actually a response to its chemical balance. Now, this chemical balance, it's pretty much ever-changing in plants and of course our orchids as well, because it is also influenced by external factors. And let's just think about the Dendrobium nobile. In order to initiate buds and flowers, usually those orchids, and not only, they need to feel a lower temperature in comparison to summertime. This external factor, temperature, actually determines a change in their chemical balance, including their hormonal balance. This external factor actually dictates if an orchid will start buds or flowers. So bottom line, external factors do influence plant behavior, and we can clearly see this in our orchids' behavior, not only in my example, but in many other examples. We know they do respond to external factors, but do they actually realize what's happening around them? And do they actually make a conscious decision whether they should flower or not? Well, the answer is no, or at least the scientists say no, not really. And they've actually performed some tests. So let's go back a little bit to that term that I used, the Stigma Tropism, and see why exactly it happens. Reading a little more the article, we can learn that growth is a complex developmental procedure. There are indeed many requirements that are needed for both touch perception and a stigmotropic response to occur. And well, I think that's pretty logical because we know some plants do not really respond, at least in a visible way, to touch sensations. Cacti certainly don't really respond to touch sensations. If we put a stake in a cacti pot, it will not start to climb on it. That is what this statement actually implies, and it's quite true. It goes on saying that one of these factors that is responsible for this phenomenon is, what do you know, calcium. So it would appear there have been a series of experiments back in 1995, I was around in that period, on a particular plant that produces tendrils. And what they did in that experiment was to block the touch-sensing calcium channels. And what they discovered was that the responses to touch in the treated plants, which were treated with calcium inhibitors, were diminished in comparison to other plants of the same species that were not treated in this way. Therefore, we can draw the conclusion that one of the factors that is responsible for touch-sensitive plants is actually a mineral, the calcium, not a response of a certain brain. Now, of course, the chemistry is a little bit more complicated than this, but we just took a little section of it. So one of the factors actually responsible for touch is a mineral, but there are other factors as well. In a different study, which I read a while back, and I hope I can find it and share it with you down below in the description, and PS, all of these things that you see on the screen, I'll link you down below to them, so you read them, at least get the terms and further research with other resources you might find more truthful than, let's say, maybe Wikipedia. But yeah, that article was actually researching, if I'm not mistaken, cucumber, and what they found in the tendrils were the presence of certain cells which were arched. Now, these cells were actually determining the shape of the coil and actually that swirling shape. Oh, I didn't do my homework, but no worries, I'll share with you down below the link to that article. So yet again, we can talk about a chemical balance within that certain structure. It is not a truly conscious decision of the plant. If you will, it's more of an automated response to that stimuli. Why? Well, just because that's how the plant is programmed to work. Our bodies are programmed to work in a certain way. We breathe without actually realizing. It's an automated reflex. In plants, it's pretty much the same way. To certain stimuli, they have automated responses. Now, of course, the difference between us and plants is that we can make conscious decisions and we can actually observe what we're doing and figure out which responses are automated with us. Well, as far as evidence go, plants don't really feel that. They just go with the automated response. And whenever we say in the hobby that the plant decided to make a keiki instead of a flower spike, well, that's a response to its chemical balance. It's genetics, because genetics do influence the chemical balance, particularly when it comes to hybridizing and all of that. It's just pretty much an automated response, and due to ease of dialogue, we just use terms that we normally use in describing us. Now, here's a very interesting aspect of the thigmotropic response. If we read on the article, we can learn that the plant biologist Mark Jaffe performed a simple preliminary experiment using pea plants. And what he discovered is that this touch response did not happen in the dark. Yes, it did happen in daylight, but when the plant did not receive light, it really didn't care it was touched. Why would this be? Well, let's make a simple logical assumption. The plant acts on touch because it has an ultimate goal, to reach light. When this ultimate goal is taken away, then the fact that it can feel with its tendrils becomes useless. So the purpose of actually having sensory capacity of the sorts is not to feel pain or to understand what its environment is, it's simply to get the light. Once you eliminate the possibility of getting light, then the fact that a plant can feel the environment becomes useless. Therefore, it's not really interested in that. And that's a pretty important experiment, I would say, because it takes away from the hypothesis that plants feel things to understand their environment. Yes, they do understand their environment in a certain way, but not if it doesn't serve a purpose. And a simple purpose, such as having light, as you can see, defeats the purpose of actually feeling its environment. Therefore, more important than anything for a plant is to get light, which of course determines if a plant survives or not. Not to feel if it's a branch, if it's a finger, if it's something else, if it's cold or anything. The ultimate goal is light. I find that actually very interesting, and I didn't know about it until today. There you go. Thank you guys. You are actually teaching me stuff. So having this very simplified explanation or basics on plant movement and behavior in response to stimuli, let's now go back a little bit with orchids. Now, many orchids that we grow are not vines. But at the same time, they do kinda act like vines in a certain way, meaning they develop on a host. And that host can be a tree or a rock, depending on the orchid and its location. So being that they don't produce tendrils or they don't have a swirling stem, what do they have that keeps them on that tree or rock at a certain distance from the ground, a place where they receive light and other benefits? Well, it's the root system. Now, if you've ever grown an orchid or two, you know that the root system actually attaches very well to surfaces. The roots of an orchid are actually responsible to a very important aspect in their natural habitat, anchoring and stabilizing the orchid, keeping it safe from falling down and being prone to being eaten by other animals, or simply not have enough light or be drowned to death on the forest floor, let's say. Root behavior is in a way similar to the tendril behavior. And here is where my observations will start to take in. Yet again, because I didn't really find pertinent articles to actually explain the exact science behind the orchid root. But it's easy to draw some conclusions from observation and experience. The roots actually grow on surfaces and attach to surfaces. And these surfaces might be various. It can be the side of the pot. It can be the rim of the pot. I don't know if you ever had those roots that just go and swirl the rim of the pot. They can also be a mount, and they wrap themselves on that mount, whatever the mount might be, whatever the material might be. And they can also go and actually attach themselves to other orchids if they're very close. So we can definitely observe this behavior in orchid roots, not the leaves or the stem, but definitely the roots. So maybe it's safe to assume that the roots actually can feel the surfaces, and they can respond to that touch stimuli in a certain way by attaching themselves to that certain object and growing in a certain manner on that particular object. In the orchid hobby, pretty much this is how that saying that my orchid feels secure started to take effect. I know that some of us use it in many different ways, but actually the beginning was the attachment thing. It is a belief, I'm not going to say if I believe it or not, but it is a belief with some orchid growers that an orchid will feel better or grow faster and more vigorous if it feels attached. And why do we say this? Well, because we think about these orchids in nature. They depend on the roots for being anchored. And judging by how the roots grow in all directions and how they actually start to behave differently when they feel a certain structure, we just draw the conclusion that roots can actually determine a certain chemical balance in the orchid that makes it direct more energy to certain structures such as leaves and flowers if the roots determine that chemical balance through attaching themselves. This sounded pretty complicated, right? Well, pretty much what we mean is that the orchid feels it is secure in one place, therefore it can relax and divert energy to flowers. That's pretty much what we mean. If it's true or not, I really don't know, and it's pretty complicated for us to give a definite answer. We can have opinions, but our opinions are not facts. But definitely we can say that roots do have a response to touching stimuli. Roots not only have a response to these touch stimuli, but also to other external factors, such as light. This again is an observation of mine. Now here we have the Renanthera philippinensis. This orchid was being kept hanging, and the roots were actually facing the inside of my greenhouse, and this side was facing the window. I really have observed with many of my orchids that roots have a tendency to grow towards the shade, not towards the light. And what happened to this orchid is I potted it and I put it on there, actually, with this side facing the window, the light. Look what the roots are doing. They're turning back. This is not the only case. And this is a profile of my Vandapatera delight. The sunny side is this side, and the side that faces the greenhouse is this side. If we take a look, all of the roots that sprouted are actually growing on this side, in this direction. While the roots on this side, you can see there are pretty much no roots. We only have one here that is already starting to turn. So these are just a few examples, but I did have a lot of examples. Now, why does this happen? Because roots photosynthesize. Because roots photosynthesize, so they are photosensible, they can determine where light is. And because the main function of the roots is actually to absorb moisture and nutrients, not to photosynthesize, they actually go towards the shade because the shade is where water is more present. In sunlight, water evaporates faster, right? In the shade, it doesn't evaporate so fast. That's just my observation and my conclusion. It doesn't have to be real, but that's what I observed. So yet again, we can see a certain behavior due to external stimuli. In this case, we are not referring to a touching stimuli, but to a different external factor such as light. So light actually determined a chemical response from the orchid, at least when it comes to roots. But if we think about orchids themselves, the other structures, the stem and the leaves, you might already know that orchids tend to grow towards the light with the leaves and the flower spikes. And this is very, very visible on Phalaenopsis orchids, which just flop over. Well, yet again, it is a response to stimuli. The leaves have as a main function to photosynthesize as opposed to roots. So they do try to go towards the light where they can photosynthesize better. Also, flower spikes go to the light, but not to photosynthesize, but to be more visible. Because the flowers are the way an orchid propagates. They need to be visible. Where can they be more visible? Where the light is, not where the shade is. So yet again, a response to environment. But these responses are actually happening due to a chemical composition in the orchid. The orchid herself doesn't decide this is where shade is and this is where I need to point my flowers and so on. It is part of its genetics, of its complex internal structure and internal chemical balance. The things that determine growth are a bunch of cells combined with some hormones and some calcium channels, it would appear, and I'm sure a lot more things that I'm not aware of, but of course we can always research. And these chemicals are ever changing depending on what happens in its environment. If I were to change the position of the orchid like so, the roots will start to come back rather than grow in that direction. They will start to swirl, like in the case of the Renanthera. Why? Because external factors changed, and the way those cells are positioned changed as well, therefore determining a different response. So as we can see, our orchids do respond to our environment. When it comes to sensorial touches, though, our orchids don't really respond, at least visibly, if we do this to the leaves. They will, however, respond to damage, yes. But to simple sensorial touch, they don't really respond with all those structures. You might already know that if we stake orchids, they will not attach to the stake or grow around the stake. They will still go to the light. Why? There's nothing to actually feel a touch here. What we have in this structure are components that respond to light. However, roots are very different. If we place a stake inside the pot, we might notice that the root finds the stake and starts to grow around it. That is a sensory response simply because the chemical structure is different in the root than it is in the stem or cane or pseudobulb. So yes, we can say that orchids feel, but it really isn't the way we feel. It is a response indeed, and they do interact with the environment. But what we mean when we say it feels secure or it feels happy is actually what we observe with the orchid and our conclusions. Of course, if we see an orchid produces multiple growths that grow really nice, luscious and big, and they produce flower spikes, and of course the orchid has a nice root system, and pretty much the orchid looks good, it doesn't look suffering, we will draw the conclusion that the orchid is happy because it has positive responses. An orchid's goal is to grow and to reproduce. If it meets these goals, we can say it's happy. Is it really happy in the sense of the word? No, not really. It's a whole bunch of responses to external factors and stimuli. So pretty much that's what we refer to. And when it comes to an orchid feeling secure, at least me, as far as I'm concerned, I am referring to the roots being able to attach. I didn't really research this. I'm not entirely sure if there are certain definite studies that can give me the answer. It is just my opinion that if an orchid's roots feel through those chemical compounds I just talked about, that they are attached, they are secure, they're not moved around all the time, direct its energy to other structures, leaves, pseudobulbs, flowers even. But pretty much this is how they actually feel what's going on in their environment. And their responses are automated. And as we can see from that little experiments, we can actually intervene to change these responses. As you've seen, if the scientists blocked the calcium channels, responses were different. Therefore, sustaining the idea that the response is automated. Alrighty, this is a little insert. I know you might say right now that, no, wait, flower spikes actually do respond to touch because if you know, when they hit a leaf, they start to avoid the leaf or grow under the leaf and reach the light. Well, I don't know what to say about that. It might just be a response to pressure. I shall demonstrate using two materials. Let's focus. So let's say this is the leaf. And let's say this is the flower spike that grows. This is a little bendy. So if a flower spike reaches the leaf, you might say, oh, it feels the leaf and grows under the leaf. I'm not sure, because look what happens if I push. If I start to push, the so-called flower spike will start to avoid the leaf. So maybe what we see as avoiding leaves is just a pressure response. If you put pressure on a flower spike, it will bend, but it will continue to grow. So the pressure of growing makes it look like the flower spike is actually responding, when in fact, I'm not sure if it actually responds, if we think that flower spikes actually pierce the leaves to grow. So yeah, that's a little thing I just thought about now, might just be pressure response. So that's pretty much the basics of the subject. I'm sure it's very, very complicated the more we get into it, but it's quite fascinating. So I did want to make this video for a long time now, ever since I made the water culture video in which people were saying the orchids feel secure in a jar, even if the roots are not attached. And yeah, I don't know, maybe they feel secure from the point of view of water, maybe they don't from other points of view. How this will affect the orchid, it's just up for us to observe in time. I have also had comments saying that actually plants feel more and they actually can feel pain and stuff like that. And well, this is the dangerous side of the subject that I don't want to get into. I just try to establish the facts, what we know. Opinions are not facts. And furthermore, if you are searching for answers, it would be a great idea to actually search for them not in the news, as most of us do, because we read an article or just read a title, newsflash, plants feel, and then, you know, everything goes a little bit crazy. No, if you want true answers, go read some scientific studies. If you don't trust the internet, that's fine. You can go to the library and search for some books. For the basics, you will find answers, but with books it's tricky because books can get outdated really, really fast, especially in this time of ever-changing developments. So if you do read books, make sure they're kind of recent, not from 40 years ago. The basics might still be the same, but 40 years ago, I'm not sure if we knew about all of these plant hormones and these arching cells and all of that. So definitely you can go and research from multiple sources, people you might know with studies in this field, or even your teachers. If you're still at school, it's a great subject to talk about, but do not fall into the trap of actually believing TV and all of those things. They live because people watch. And what do people watch? Drama and sensational stuff. So it's more of a psychological game here. But news people are not scientists. They don't really know anything about the terms they use in their articles sometimes. So if they don't know, they can misinterpret a lot of things and make them more sensational than they actually are. And speaking about this subject, I'll link you down below to a video that James Oliver made. James Oliver is a comedian, but he kind of tends to talk about real life situations. I'm not telling you should believe him or anything, it's pure amusement, but I'll link you down below to a video he made, or actually a show he made regarding science in the news and how certain studies appear overnight and how they are interpreted by the news and how they always change. It's pretty funny. It's an adult show, so you'll have warnings in the description below, but yeah, it's really funny. Bottom line, do research, understand facts, and try to leave emotions out of things. Because science does kind of tend to be exact in the broad spectrum of the word. It is ever changing, yes, but it's always good to have the basics and yeah, have fun researching. Alrighty, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hope I at least gave you some things to research about if not understanding other things, and let me know about your experiences and what you have observed, what your opinions are in the comments down below. So if you've enjoyed this video, you know the drill, give it a like, a share would be wonderful, and if you'd like to see other videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a regular basis and also turn on notifications so YouTube alerts you every time, because if you don't, it might not alert you that I posted a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!